Let's begin by asking ourselves, who is Christopher Columbus? Not the founding father or hero of some textbooks, but the man, painted in other textbooks today as colonist, enslaver, symbol of conquest. For the first part, the first video, of a 3-day mini lesson for our U.S. History and Catholicism course, we're standing on this dark battlefield of memory, but also working through it. It is a glimpse into the mind of an everyday American citizen, one online blogger I don't even know. I'll spotlight 2 articles of his today. In examining these 2 articles, I can tell he attempts to do what I do: educate instead of yell, invite instead of enforce, see nuance in humanity in this age of clickbait absurdity. So listen closely today, even though it may seem he is running counter to traditional Catholic teaching, even if you're disagreeing with it the whole time, even though it is different from what I will present in lessons 2 and 3 of this mini unit on Columbus. Today I practically abandon the course's thesis just to make a point, and not shove all 3 lessons into one that no one will watch in full anyway. I will show you a glimpse of the journey through a complex question, which is, of course, diametrically opposed to today's modern world and its genius keyboard warriors. I do it for a reason, for myself and for you. I do it to show you that not only is history not static, but our own psychologies as we grow aren't either. And yet still, in line with the ultimate thesis of this course, there is one source that can accommodate all of those psychologies. It is that source, that love, that city, that seed. That is the focus of this unique look on history. Also, very quickly, as this introduction, while necessary, has been long enough, take inventory of our lessons on Queen Isabella, as she will play a prominent role again today. This first of 3 videos relies heavily on Andrew Ganner's articles, titled Back to the Beginning, A Catholic View of Columbus from October 2020, and a follow-up titled Flawed Heroes, Mixed Legacies, The Complexity of Columbus, October 2021. Of course, Columbus Day is October 13th. Interestingly enough, the same date as the miracle of the sun at Fatima in 1917, and more personally, the date I met my wife in 2023. But anyway, Ganner's first article leans heavily on Dr. Warren H. Carroll, award-winning Catholic historian, founder of Christendom College, and author of the major multi-volume series, A History of Christendom. Dr. Carroll was also the husband and participant in his wife's history course Ganner himself took as a high schooler at Seton Hall High School in Virginia. So right off the bat, we are breaking the binary of Catholic versus non-Catholic. Right off the bat with this quasi-dark perspective, we are sticking with voices that attach themselves to Catholicism. And in the spirit of taking on a certain role myself in this first video of our mini-series on Columbus, I want to read to you this very simple, entirely bleak statement from Ganner himself. Christopher Columbus is not worth defending. This conclusion from Ganner's first article sets the emotional tone of a source that many people who simply do searches online will see. It's concise, it's punchy, it cuts like a sword through legend and myth. It may even anger a traditional Catholic enough to click out of the article entirely. I ask that you not do that with me at any point today. Again, remember, another side of this will come as I develop these lessons in the coming days. Here's how Ganner opens the first article from October 2020. I believe in nothing if not the fact that the truth is often complex and nuanced, requiring careful distinction, particularly when the virtues and vices of fallen humanity are involved. For that reason, I was up until this year decidedly neutral on our national controversy surrounding Christopher Columbus. Not because I believed him to be a saint by any stretch of the imagination, but because I believed him to be a complex figure, someone whom I was confident neither in praising nor condemning, without having honestly taken the time for myself to thoroughly investigate and consider the competing arguments on both sides. Prior to this year, if you had asked me for an accessible resource summarizing my view of Christopher Columbus, I would have pointed you to the YouTube video, In Defense of Columbus, An Exaggerated Evil, an assessment which, even by its very title, appeared to capture and rightly hold in tension a critical but balanced sense of the pros and cons. But today, I would point you to Dr. Warren H. Carroll, award-winning Catholic historian, founder of Christendom College, and author of the major multi-volume series, A History of Christendom. For it was none other than Dr. Carroll's assessment of Christopher Columbus that, in the end, finally solidified my opinion, swept away my remaining doubts, and convinced me of the truth. Christopher Columbus is simply not worth defending. This passage highlights a personal journey from neutrality to condemnation, underscoring how powerful and persuasive the evidence against Columbus can be for modern thinkers. It struck me because I too write and fight against false binary thinking, instead working to shift the binary focus toward God and not God, the two loves, the two cities, the two seeds we've been talking about. So to see that Ganner had experienced a shift piqued my interest as a potential non-scholarly source to include in this lesson. Now let's move on to more from Ganner's first article, his first pull quotes from Dr. Carroll's work. Pulls, he says, swept away his remaining hesitations. Instead of bringing the mutinous Spaniards to order and halting their depredations on the Indians, Columbus blamed the natives for everything and sent a force to round them up with horses and hounds. The Spanish colonists were then allowed to take as many as they pleased as their own slaves. That's from Isabel of Spain, the Catholic Queen, page 262. Meanwhile, the spiral of disintegration and destruction was continuing on Hispaniola. Columbus's great slave raid roused the Indians to all-out war. Columbus, now healthy again and in personal command, ranged over the island, killing, capturing, and terrorizing the Indians into submission. Sad to say, Columbus seemed interested in baptizing Indians only after bringing them to Spain. Justice was not done for the Indians, but there was simply no way at this time for Isabel to have ascertained what really happened on Hispaniola. It was too far away, the events were too confused, and those reporting to her had too many axes of their own to grind. The full truth was not learned until the investigations of de las Casas many years later. Columbus dispatched letters to Isabel and Fernando. He asked without apology for the full legalization of a slave trade in Indians, though Isabel had repeatedly made it clear that she would never permit that. These letters from Columbus created a bad impression, which was supplemented by other critical reports from Hispaniola, and convinced Isabel that Columbus should not continue as sole governor. She must have been disappointed by the very small spiritual return in Indian conversions thus far, and by Columbus's persistent attempts to enslave those whose souls he claims to have gone there to save. During that year, the situation on that now bloody island went from bad to worse. Columbus felt he had to pardon Roldan and mollify him and the other rebels by granting each Spanish settler a substantial tract of cultivated land with a number of Indians to till it, solely for his own personal support and enrichment. This was the famous encomienda system, which de las Casas, the apostle to the Indians, spent his life fighting, in which Isabel's mighty grandson, Charles V, was to struggle desperately and with only limited success to eliminate. If not quite slavery, it was certainly serfdom involving hard work, imposed upon a people who would often die quickly if forced to do it. Ganner sums it up by saying, as it turns out, the prospect of maintaining any neutrality on the Columbus debate was simply a sanguine self-delusion. Here we hear Columbus not only tolerating, but enabling violence and slavery, through a direct quote from a respected Catholic historian. This doesn't appear to be simple politicized exaggeration. It's a sourced accusation. I'll continue with the rest of Ganner's first article. There is a good reason why our nation's celebration of Columbus Day has increasingly fallen out of favor and become an annual controversy, and it has nothing to do with anti-Catholic liberal conspiracies to revise and distort noble historical truths. There is good reason why I did not absorb an enthusiastic view of Columbus from my deeply Catholic high school history classes with Anne and Warren Carroll. And it has everything to do with Catholic historians maintaining a disposition of sober intellectual honesty regarding the indisputable and horrifically grave sins of a famous Catholic navigator. Indeed, were there any truth to the theory of anti-Catholic bias against Columbus, we would not find modern secular historians crediting the very same Catholic monarchs of Spain who financed Columbus. Quote, Queen Isabella emerged as an early champion of Indian rights. As Columbus kept insisting on his plans of enslavement, and as men continued to ship Indian slaves in one guise or another, Isabella became exasperated. All along, she had been extremely supportive of the admiral. But by 1499, when she learned of the arrival of yet more Indians, she famously exploded. Who is this Columbus who dares to give out my vassals as slaves? Isabella and Ferdinand freed many Indians, and astonishingly, mandated that many of them be returned to the New World. The opposition of the Catholic monarchs was a serious blow to Columbus's plans for a transatlantic Indian slave trade. Andres Resendez, The Other Slavery, The Uncovered Story of Indian Enslavement in America. On June 20th, 1500, a royal decree condemned Columbus's taking of Indian slaves in the Caribbean, prohibited their sale, mandated their freedom, and forbade that Indians be taken as slaves in the future. Rolena Adorno. Ganner closes with, if we wish to be intellectually honest with ourselves, we must set aside the childish mythos of Christopher Columbus, reckon honestly with the demonstrable gravity of his sins and failings, and cease defending the indefensible. That's where he stood in October 2020. I respect it, particularly because of how he lays it out, particularly because he handcuffs the counter-argument that would most certainly point the finger at the woke left. I respect it because, rhetorically speaking, he's checking many of the boxes, at least as many as he can for a non-scholarly blog such as this one. But that's part of the point of my own rhetoric today. A simple click on Ganner's homepage on Medium revealed something that will allow me to navigate even more of his brain's network and help my own classroom see how complex the study of history can be if we're honest with every part of ourselves, including the political, the personal, the religious. I want to present Ganner's article in full, the second one, as I see in it something very familiar. In his first salvo, he is brief, laser-focused, and personal. But apparently after receiving pushback from readers, he felt compelled to write another, more substantive piece, exploring himself with a brand new flashlight. All the dark corners, not of a history text necessarily, but of his own mind. It is an invaluable lesson for us that I want to share with you today, that to truly grow in God's wisdom, we must practice what is called metacognition. We have to revisit our thoughts and our biases on a constant basis, like Ganner, navigating those little nooks and crannies undusted. This is how our perspectives are unpacked, sharpened, cleaned, and made more and more ready for public consumption and trust. This is how and why Catholic ecumenical councils have been in place through the centuries. They don't reinvent dogma. They return to simpler explanations of it and dig more deeply into the details so as better to understand it themselves and then to teach it to the faithful. In short, we must think about our thinking on a constant basis if we are to in any way believe we have anything to offer other people in the way of education or wisdom. Mr. Ganner might read what I will read to you from the textbook in the third installment of this little 3-lesson package in the works and absolutely scoff at it, absolutely disagree with it. And yet here I am, reading what may be called an opponent's work, just to prove a point about what it means to seek education, to seek wisdom. Here is Ganner's article in full, written nearly 1 year to the day after the first. It's titled Flawed Heroes, Mixed Legacies, The Complexity of Columbus. Last year I wrote an essay arguing that Christopher Columbus is not worth defending, on the basis of text by Dr. Warren Carroll, a prominent and respected Catholic historian who heavily influenced my high school education and for whom I hold great respect. This year, I wish to reflect on one of the most interesting criticisms that was raised against my argument. That is, the words of Dr. Carroll himself, who published a 1992 essay on honoring Christopher Columbus. At nearly the very same time, he also published Isabel of Spain, the Catholic Queen, 1991, and A History of Christendom, Volume 3, The Glory of Christendom, 1993, the two texts upon which my argument heavily relied. At the conclusion of his 1992 essay, Dr. Carroll summarizes his thesis. Columbus was a flawed hero, as all men are flawed, including heroes, and his flaws are of a kind particularly offensive to today's culture. But he was nevertheless a hero, achieving in a manner unequaled in the history of exploration and the sea, changing history forever. Heroes need not be perfect. Indeed, given the fallen nature of man, none can be perfect. It is right to criticize their failings, but wrong to deny their greatness and the inspiration they can give. Christopher Columbus is the discoverer of America, and by that discovery, ultimately responsible for America's evangelization. And for this, we should forever honor him. This is certainly high vision of Columbus, and indeed, it echoes the same vision advanced by Pope Leo XIII's 1892 encyclical, given on the Columbus quadricentennial, precisely 100 years earlier. But it is worthwhile to pause and carefully examine the lines of argumentation that are at play in Dr. Carroll's conclusion. At the outset, Dr. Carroll and I share a common, crucial starting point, and this, a starting point seemingly not even acknowledged by the lofty vision of Pope Leo XIII. That is, the acceptance of Columbus as flawed. This coexists with an acknowledgement that all men are flawed, including heroes, and that even among heroes, it is right to criticize their failings. These are no small concessions, and they harmonize well with the opening sentence of my original essay, which affirmed that the truth is often complex and nuanced, requiring careful distinction, particularly when the virtues and vices of fallen humanity are involved. The real difference, then, is less about the facts, less about the reality of Columbus's flaws, and more about the moral weight that we assign to those facts, ultimately culminating in the critical question: does the gravity of Columbus's flaws outweigh his merits? Indeed, my thesis that Columbus is not worth defending does not logically amount to a claim that Columbus has absolutely no merits to speak of. This is simply not what the argument requires or otherwise implies. The claim that someone is, or is not, worth defending reduces to nothing more than a judgment that their known sins and failings are outweighed by, or outweigh, whatever merits or accomplishments can also be credited to them. The central fact to remember is simply that fallen persons are not cartoon heroes and villains. Thus we must carefully make distinctions and avoid obscuring the truth, whatever that might ultimately be. Heroes can have remarkable flaws. Villains have incredible virtues. Heretics can accomplish great things. Saints can sin gravely. If we value the truth, we have nothing to fear from exploring doubts, encountering complexity, and embracing nuance. As an aside, this is what I'm constantly saying in my written work about Donald Trump. You can support Trump without idolizing him. And I think that's a very real danger in our society. The necessity of this approach applies to Christopher Columbus, and it applies to Isabella of Spain. It applies to many, and I'll give you a chance to read through some of those here. It applies to the French Revolution, the founding fathers of the United States, and to every last one of our favorite political heroes and villains. It applies to Dr. Warren Carroll, and it applies to myself. Columbus was a flawed man. This is beyond doubt. Should we nevertheless judge Columbus to be a hero, despite his flaws? Dr. Carroll argued in the affirmative. And yet we must ask, On what basis does he argue this? Subsequently, do we find that basis persuasive? After all, Columbus is certainly not a saint. Columbus was never canonized by the Church for his heroic virtue. And if we simply accept the horrible truth of Dr. Carroll's concession that Columbus was guilty of persistent attempts to enslave those whose souls he claimed to have gone there to save, it becomes very easy to see why he never will be canonized. So why did Dr. Carroll ultimately deem Columbus a hero, despite this? An initial reading of his argument suggests that Columbus was heroic on account of his navigational skills, unequaled in the history of exploration and the sea, changing history forever. But this fact alone, however impressive in its historical context, is hardly sufficient to ward off all criticism of the man's actions and legacy. It seems instead that the deeper heart of the claim for heroism rests on the argument that Columbus is the discoverer of America, and by that discovery, ultimately responsible for America's evangelization. And for this, we should forever honor him. But is that conclusion persuasive? Does it follow from the premise? Now, in raising this question, I am not referring to the premise that Columbus should be considered the discoverer of America. Let that highly disputed premise be qualified, nuanced, or simply granted outright for the sake of the argument. Let Christopher Columbus be heralded as the discoverer. Does it follow that he is, as a result of that discovery, ultimately responsible for America's evangelization? It simply does not. The more sober truth is that Christopher Columbus, the man who asked without apology for the full legalization of a slave trade in Indians, the man who, in personal command, ranged over the island killing, capturing, and terrorizing the Indians into submission, the man who seemed interested in baptizing Indians only after bringing them to Spain, this man was not personally responsible for America's evangelization in any meaningful sense, and cannot in hindsight be honestly credited with this. The Christianization of the Americas was not Columbus's achievement, but it would be the responsibility and accomplishment of the men and women who came after him, those who actually lived among the Native Americans, preached Christ to them, baptized them, loved them, and defended them against unjust enslavement and exploitation. Those are the men and women who are ultimately responsible for America's evangelization. Or perhaps the flourishing of Christianity in the Americas should be most properly credited to Our Lady of Guadalupe, seeing as there were no less than 5 million Indian baptisms in Mexico in the first 5 years after she appeared, and perhaps as many as 9 million conversions within 8 to 10 years of her apparition, according to other authors. In any case, the inexorable conclusion is that Christopher Columbus can only be deemed accidentally responsible for the accomplishments of the holy men and women who followed in his wake. Indeed, it seems we should hold that the subsequent Christianization of the Americas did not happen because of Columbus's personal actions, but despite his personal actions. His navigational skills, however extraordinary they might have been, do not allow him to be credited retroactively as a sort of quasi-evangelist, when honestly weighed alongside his publicly documented sins. We must also remember that the ends never justify the means. Thus, as we embrace nuance in the face of complex legacies, we can and should and must be willing to entertain the possibility that some great goods, such as the Christianization of the Americas, may have at times been historically pursued through gravely evil means, such as unjust colonization and exploitation. Accordingly, we can and should and must condemn the men and women who chose to use those means, or who did not raise their voices to resist what they could and should have known was a great evil. Even the greatest good, the eternal salvation of souls, cannot immunize from criticism every means taken to reach that end. Indeed, it is simply depraved and blasphemous to suggest that authentic evangelization ever requires grave moral evils, justifies the temporal suffering of innocent lives, or otherwise necessitates certain worldly injustices at the expense of innocent populations. This brings us directly to Dr. Carroll's strangely framed concession that Columbus's flaws were of a kind particularly offensive to today's culture. For on the contrary, as a friend of mine once observed, the fun thing about the natural law is that it doesn't depend on what year it is. It is always gravely wrong to pursue the subjugation or enslavement of innocent persons, or to tolerate their rape and exploitation by the men under your command. Personal sins that inflict grave harm upon innocent persons, and they are sins, not mere character flaws, should be particularly offensive to every culture, especially a culture that wishes to describe itself as Christian. Of course, we do concede that the clarity of the natural law can be obscured in the hearts and minds of men, even to the point that grave evils such as slavery or murder can become pervasive and systemic within a culture, and thereby cease to be remarkable to a majority of citizens. But another fun thing about natural law is that it rarely lurks far from the surface, especially when questions of justice and innocent lives are involved. It should be no surprise, then, that some individuals living in the very same day and age as Columbus did know better and fiercely condemned Spanish crimes against humanity. Indeed, this merits repeating. Queen Isabel of Spain had repeatedly made it clear to Columbus that she would never permit the legalization of a slave trade in Indians. Columbus knew of her vehement disapproval. And not only this, but in the text of his very same 1992 essay, arguing in favor of honoring Columbus for the discovery of America, Dr. Carroll transparently concedes, quote, "Sick, frustrated, angry, and unable to control the Spaniards on the island, Columbus blamed the Indians for his troubles and the very small production of gold. In January 1495, he seized over 1,000 Indians to make them slaves. There can be no excuse for this, but it is very important to remember that it was contrary to Spanish law and vigorously countermanded by Queen Isabel as soon as she found out about it. She declared firmly that no one had authorized her admiral, i.e. Columbus, to treat her subjects in this manner, released the Indian captives who had been brought to Spain, and made clear her unalterable opposition to enslavement of the Indians. She then sent a former member of her household to investigate what Columbus was doing as governor of Hispaniola and report back to her. Before he could reach Hispaniola, full-scale war with its Indians had broken out because of Columbus's seizure of the slaves. The Spaniards easily won all military engagements with the Indians, demanded from them a tribute in gold too much for them to collect, and ravaged their lands and pursued them into the mountains when they did not collect it. Aguado's arrival forced Columbus to stop all of this, and he returned to Spain in June 1496. There is simply no ambiguity upon which to build a coherent and compelling argument that Columbus did not or could not have known much better regarding the evils of slavery in his day and age, or that his actions were somehow broadly in line with the moral consensus of his contemporaries. And more than this, even if none of Columbus's contemporaries had been capable of helping him identify these evils, and this is manifestly false, even then, that would hardly be a compelling defense of his actions, much less a worthy argument in favor of our annually celebrating or honoring this man who was personally responsible for pursuing and committing these grave evils. When it comes to our relationship with historical heroes, Dr. Carroll admits that none are perfect, and rightly holds that, quote, "It is right to criticize their failings, but wrong to deny their greatness and the inspiration they can give." And in the abstract, of course, this is perfectly true. But at the very same time, there is an equally important corollary. It is right to honor someone's personal accomplishments, but wrong to exaggerate their achievements or downplay their personal failings. If we are committed to truth and justice, then we must be committed to speaking about historical figures in a way that is just and true. Otherwise, we ourselves commit an injustice through advancing or perpetuating inaccurate historical legacies. And it is precisely a matter of questioning the greatness and inspiring value of Columbus's actions, or in the case of Pope Leo XIII's brief and perfectly fallible encyclical, questioning the historical facts serving as the foundation of the analysis upon which this argument over the legacy of Columbus must be decided. We cannot be afraid of the truth. Whenever we discover or encounter mixed legacies, we must not retreat from the facts that make us uncomfortable. On the contrary, we must invite this new complexity, allow ourselves to live in the tension, and draw nuanced judgments. And ultimately, we must remain open to the possibility that at a certain point, genuine respect for the truth might require us to cease praising or defending certain things, if we realize that they are too deeply compromised by evil. My own judgment that Columbus is not worth defending flows from this framework. It is, or so it seems to me, a simple matter of owning up to the truth of his grave sins and failures, all of which are documented and admitted even by Dr. Carroll. I want to read one sentence from this again, and if you take anything away from this philosophically, I want you to take this, because I believe this can very much relate to today's political landscape. Whenever we discover or encounter mixed legacies, we must not retreat from the facts that make us uncomfortable. On the contrary, we must invite this new complexity, allow ourselves to live in the tension, and draw nuanced judgments. This is from someone that would likely disagree with much of the textbook that I'm using in this course. Of course, it remains possible that people of goodwill can reach different conclusions about how to evaluate mixed legacies and where to draw the line between flawed hero and anti-villain. But we are not slaves to the fallible opinions of individual historians. You are not a slave to my opinion in this course, is what he's saying. And I'll say it right now. It's one reason I'm doing this lesson today. The point of this course is to invite individual sovereign thought, deeply steeped in prayer to God for wisdom. Continuing, we are not slaves to the fallible opinions of individual historians, and intellectual honesty demands that we engage with and evaluate arguments before taking them up as our own. So if anyone wishes to stand alongside Dr. Carroll and argue in favor of publicly honoring Columbus, especially with a national holiday, then they must coherently expound the greatness of his personal accomplishments without denying or downplaying his personal sins and failings. I have yet to see a truly coherent and respectable argument to this end. So what do we do with all of this? What do we do with this? We listen. We listen, not to surrender, but to sharpen, not to retreat, but to remember that Catholic tradition has never feared difficult evidence, only dishonest shortcuts. Ganner's work is careful, thoughtful, and deeply respectful of the Church, even as it levels serious charges against one of her most famous sons. If his account is true, then yes, we as traditional Catholics must be willing to take a hard, unflinching look at Columbus, not to appease modern narratives, not to side with the woke left, but to stand before God with clean hands and honest hearts. And that doesn't mean that Ganner is right, but it does mean he deserves to be heard. And if nothing else, this first lesson of our mini-series is a model for how to engage a counter-argument without falling into the childish trap of today's binary noise. Part 2 will offer a very different view, but if you're still here, still thinking, still willing to hold tension instead of rushing to a side, then I think we've already begun to win the war for memory.